Here we go. So I saw somebody ask right off the bat if there were any women. I think they said girls actually. If there are any women in the audience, and if there are, well, that's good. So welcome. Thanks to all you Patreon people for your continued support. It's a really big deal. It's made a huge difference, and you're a big part of the reason that biblical lecture was so ridiculously successful. I think more than 2 million people have watched it so far. So that's success by any stretch of the imagination. So let's start with some questions here. I've got the live chat going, and we also set it up so that we had questions taken to begin with that people could upvote, which seems to be a good idea. Let's start with one from Practice Cube. What would be a practical approach for developing your shadow? Well, that's a good one. Let's do a little review of Jungian psychology. The first thing is, if you want to know about this, the proper source is Carl Jung's Collected Works, Volume 9. Volume 9, and there's two parts to Volume 9, A and B, published as separate texts. And Volume 9 is called Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. And the other one is called Ion. But in Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, there's a good discussion of the persona and the shadow. And the persona, you could say, is a good way of thinking about it. You know, you watch all those rom-coms where there's always kind of a beta male guy who's being real friendly and always failing miserably with the women because basically he's lying to himself and to them. He's a persona. And a persona is the face that you show to the world when you're trying to pretend and to convince yourself and others that you're, I would say, harmless, but we could say a good person. But a good person isn't harmless. A good person is capable of, well, maybe a good person is capable of anything, but is willing to hold that in abeyance. I read this interesting commentary a little while ago on a statement by Christ in the New Testament, and the statement generally interpreted is that the meek shall inherit the earth. But I was looking up the multiple translations of the word meek, and meek is actually derived from a Greek word, of course, because the Bible, at least some of the original forms of the Bible, were in Greek. And that word didn't exactly mean meek. It meant something like those who have weapons and the ability to use them, but determined to keep them sheathed, will inherit the world. And that means that people who are capable of force, let's say, but decide not to use it, are in the proper moral position. And Nietzsche commented on that a fair bit too. You know, he thought of most morality as cowardice, not because morality itself was cowardice, but because most people who are cowards disguise their cowardice as morality, and they claim that their harmlessness, which is actually a consequence of their fear and inability to be harmful, say, or to be dangerous, is actually a sign of their moral integrity. And that's a really bad idea. So, you know, if you're an axe murderer but you don't have an axe, that doesn't mean that you're moral. So now, with regards to, so that's the persona. And the persona is the mask that you wear, and that's what persona means, is the mask that you wear to convince yourself and the world that you're not a terrible monster, so that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't have to run away screaming. You know, and you might think, well, that's a bit of an overstatement, but Jung was very interested in phenomena such as, say, the psychological phenomena that would characterize the actions of someone who might be an Auschwitz camp guard, for example. And you know, that's a pretty monstrous form of behavior. And the thing about Auschwitz camp guards is that there's no reason to assume, really, that they were much different than normal people. Now, there would have been exceptions, obviously, but, and what that means is that perhaps you too could be an Auschwitz camp guard, and perhaps you would even derive some enjoyment out of it, and you might think not, but you shouldn't think not so quickly. And what that also implies is that if you could see what that meant when you looked in the mirror and looked at yourself, you might run away screaming, because you'd have a revelation of just exactly what the human being is capable of. And that's a very unpleasant revelation, and also one of the things that stops people from being enlightened, because that revelation of the evil of the self is part of the journey to enlightenment, and an early part. Now the shadow would be all the parts of the personality that the persona rejects, and that might be the aggressive elements. Certainly that's the case for people who are hyper agreeable. And now you can tell, I think one of the best, there's two pathways to the development of the shadow, and they're tightly allied with one another. The fundamental pathway is truth, and that's to face the bitter truth about yourself. But to break that down more particularly, you might think about that as the capacity to observe your own resentment. You're going to be resentful and bitter in many situations because you don't get what you want. And if you watch that resentment and bitterness, you'll see that it produces fantasies that can be unbelievably dark. And that can be very frightening, and you might not want to admit to yourself that you're actually capable of having fantasies like that, or impulses like that, or aggressive feelings like that. But the thing is that if those aggressive feelings and impulses and fantasies are integrated into your character, it's like you're opening up a dialogue with a part of yourself that can be very forceful and strong and dangerous. And it's really useful to be dangerous, because if you can be dangerous, you often don't have to be. And it's often weak people. For example, it's weak men, generally speaking, who rape. You know, that's a very, very common occurrence, and that's a violent act, but it's born out of weakness, not out of strength, that's for sure. And so, anyways, you attend to your resentment honestly, and you observe yourself and what you're actually like. You got to pay attention as if you don't know yourself, as if you might harbor hidden devils, and then maybe they'll emerge. Now, Jung also felt that sort of embedded inside the shadow were the contrasexual tendencies. And so, for example, sometimes you see people who are well-developed, men, let's say, and we can also talk about women in this regard. Men who've integrated their shadow often also develop a kind of peculiar grace that would be a consequence of not only allowing their aggressive side to step forward, but also their feminine and compassionate side that they may have kept squelched because of embarrassment about it, or because they'd been harassed for being weak, or any number of things. So, but the practical approach for developing your shadow, I would say, is to contemplate and consider your resentment and notice what it says. And because your resentment will also tell you what you have to say. You know, so look at what happened at Google this weekend. You know, James Damore wrote that memo, and you can imagine he was pretty angry and perhaps even somewhat resentful at having to attend that diversity seminar. And I'm really just using this as an example. But what he did was decide that meant that he had something that he had to say. And then look at the consequences of that, man. It's absolutely unbelievable. And so, you know, if you're feeling oppressed at work, or you're oppressed in your life, or you know, or you're oppressing yourself, then you got to notice that you're feeling oppressed. Then you have to notice that you're feeling resentful and angry and bitter, and maybe even like Cain in the story of Cain and Abel, because Cain is sort of the archetypal bitter man. And then you have to decide what it is that you need to do in order to remove from yourself that bitterness. And that usually means that there's something that you have to say. And then you have to say it because your soul depends on it. And not only does your soul depend on it, I would say the fate of the world depends on it. Because, you know, you might be wrong, and then you should be straightened out. Maybe you're just being whiny and you have to talk to somebody about that. But it may be that you're actually detecting something wrong, some tyranny that's directed towards you and other people. And it's like your moral obligation to speak up about it. And so many workplaces become toxic, to use a terrible cliche, because the people in them won't speak up for what they actually want, or they speak up too late, and then they're all twisted up about it, and you know, they're torturing other people because they're so unhappy, and so forth and so on. So, practical approach for developing your shadow fundamentally is radical honesty. And Jung said that, you know, a genuine moral effort was a good substitute for psychotherapy. What is my opinion on open relationships, polyamory, other forms of non-monogamy? Well, I think that as a medium to long-term strategy, they're completely untenable, because human beings, as far as I'm concerned, are fundamentally pair bonding. And, you know, if you're just talking about casual sex, first of all, I think casual sex is a contradiction in terms. I don't think there's anything about sex that's casual, and I think that people are deceiving themselves badly whenever they think so. They might like to live in a, you know, 1970s Playboy adolescent fantasy, but I've never seen that work under any circumstances whatsoever, and I think people get hurt badly. It's also a bad medium to long-term strategy, because, you know, pair bonding is the most stable arrangement we know of, at least so far, well, I won't even put it that way. It's the only stable mode of being that we know for the long run, and that's especially the case when you bring children into the equation. So I think it's delusional fundamentally, and I think that people who believe that such things work, I mean, sometimes they're open people and they're creative and they're exploratory and all of that, and fair enough, but often they're just unconscientious and they don't want to take any responsibility, and they want to live in this wish fulfillment fantasy where everybody can have all the sex they want all the time and it's always wonderful and no one gets hurt. And it's like, sorry, that just doesn't work in the real world. So my girlfriend is quite overweight, but I really love her. Should I try to encourage her to lose weight? Aside from personal preference, is this likely to explode into a major issue down the road? I don't think that you can fool yourself about what you're attracted to. And yes, it's certainly likely to develop into a major issue down the road. It's tough, because so the devil's in the details. Should you try to encourage her to lose weight? I guess the question is, how would you do that without disrupting the relationship? And without knowing more about the details of that, I would say that I don't know what to tell you to do about that. I think that it's necessary to be truthful in a relationship, period. But I also think that you can't use the truth to hurt. The truth is a very complicated thing, and it's a sword, and it cuts, and you can't use it to hurt. Now, maybe you would be subtle enough to figure out some way that you could both embark on a health promoting endeavor together, and that would work out. But I would say, if you're in a stable long-term relationship with someone, it's pretty much necessary for both of you to address all the issues that are making you unhappy with each other, assuming there's some give and take on that, because otherwise the relationship can easily come apart at the seams. Like, I would say my wife and I are both very hard on each other about our physical appearance, let's say, and I'd gained a fair bit of weight from the time I was, say, 40 till the time I was 50, probably because I was eating things that weren't good for me, and I would say that was primarily carbohydrates. I can tell you, if you want to lose weight, you stop eating carbohydrates, man, you'll lose weight like you wouldn't believe. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it has some dangers, but it certainly works. But the alternative the alternative is to pretend that everything's all right, and all that means is that you're likely to get drunk sometimes and someday and have an affair out of bitterness and spite in the fact that you're no longer attracted to your partner. So it's pretty rough. So that's a pretty rough way of thinking about things, but life's pretty rough. So what is the story behind the logo that you use in your intros? Where did it come from? That logo is called The Meaning of Music, and it's actually a sculpture that I made in 1985 that's about 5.5 feet by 5.5 feet and about 8 inches thick, and it's made out of foam core, which is this. It's a material that's often used as a backing for paintings or for when you get them framed. It's styrofoam sheet about 1/4 inch thick with paper on both sides, and you can cut it very accurately with an X-Acto knife. And so what I did was make a stack of those foam core sheets about 8 inches high, and I made the thing in quarters, and so that it would fit together on the wall because it would have been too big to maneuver easily. And it's a very complicated image. It's actually a three-dimensional representation of a two-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional object. And that four-dimensional object you could think of as, it's a representation of time and space. And I can tell you, I kind of have to hint at what the painting means, or the sculpture. It means the same thing that music means. You know how music unfolds and then something else unfolds within it, and then it unfolds again within it, like a rose opening into the day. Or like a lotus flower that sort of comes up from the darkest depths up through the dark water and then blooms on the surface of the water in the sun, and that's where the Buddha, what would you say, symbolically rests. So you can imagine that thing opening, and then imagine that that's what that painting is an image of, and that's the same thing as music. So it's a mandala image, and for Jung, the mandala was a symbol of the self, and the self was something that unfolds like music, which is actually why we like music. it's like the rose, the rose that you see, the geometric rose that you see in stained glass. It's the same thing. That's the stained glass window that Pinocchio's reprehensible compatriot, what's his name, Lampwick, breaks when he's in Pleasure Island, and he throws a rock to destroy the model home and to demolish the substructure of Western civilization. And so I had a very intense religious experience at one point when I was contemplating that. So when I drew the image to begin with, I drew it in about 10 minutes, kind of rough, and then I used a straight edge to straighten it all out, and a protractor or a compass to make the curves. But I drew it very quickly, and I'd been reading Jung a lot at that point, like for months of intense reading, and that image sort of popped out of me very suddenly. But it took about 3 months to make the actual image, and then I had only a quarter of it hanging on my wall because it was so big, and I had finished it after about 3 months of work. So this was back in 1985 when I was a graduate student, and I was listening to the Jupiter Symphony, which is the piece of music that I use, that was used for the intro to my videos, and it's a Mozart symphony. And this happened, man. So this happened. So I was really watching that mandala, that quarter mandala that I had made intensely, and listening to the music, trying to understand what the music was signifying, because music has intrinsic meaning, which is a very strange thing. Now, part of the reason for that is that language has meaning, and our language has a musical quality, right? And that's processed mostly by the right hemisphere, so that when people speak, there's a melody in their language, and that carries a lot of the emotional import. And then what musicians have done is figured out how to use that musical faculty, let's call it, that non-semantic musical faculty, to sort of purely denote meaning. That's part of what music means. And so, but I was still trying to understand what the meaning was, because it's nonverbal, the meaning of music, and I was trying to figure out how to articulate that, and that's partly why I made the sculpture, was to get a grip on it and to understand it. And anyways, I was really concentrating hard on that mandala and that sculpture, and I had been working on it intensely for about 3 months, so that's a lot of meditation on a single idea. And I was standing in my living room, and then I had this very strange experience. I can't explain this properly because there's no way of really describing it, but I'll do my best. So, in those Renaissance paintings, sometimes you see, well, first of all, you see great sunny skies with massive, stupendous, impressive billows of clouds, and then light shining through, the sunlight shining through in streams. Sometimes that's captured very beautifully by especially English later artists, usually that are later than the Renaissance, but you see it in Renaissance paintings too. And you also see in Renaissance paintings, especially in the earlier phase of the Renaissance, the sky opening up and God sort of peering forth through the clouds. And that's exactly what seemed to happen to me, is that I had this sense. It was like a vision, although I was still in my living room and knew it, but inside the theater of my imagination, I could feel the sky opening up. Now, it wasn't the sky. It was, I would say, the only way I can really think about it is that it was something like another dimension. And then I could feel this force descend upon me, which I think was something that, would have been considered classically something like the Holy Ghost, I suppose. And it filled me with this intense sense of paradisal, I don't know how to say it. Well, it was like being in heaven for some brief period of time, and I could feel myself transformed, transmuted as a consequence of this experience, and it was as if I was in the presence of something that was living, and I suppose that was an experience of God, if you want to put it that way. That's certainly what it seemed like, and I felt that I could live that way. I could live transfigured like that permanently if I desired it. And I thought, my God, I wouldn't be able to walk down the street in this sort of elevated state, let's say. I don't know how I would act. I don't know how I would interact with people. I don't know how people would interact with me. I just don't think that I could do it. And then I felt that whatever had descended, it seemed that as if it was sorrowful, and it departed from me slowly, and with no punitive intent, and I wouldn't say with any dissatisfaction. It was as if a gift had been offered that I wasn't in no position to receive. And I talked to my wife soon afterwards. I shook physically for about half an hour after that experience, like I was shaking, like you shake after a car accident, if you've ever been in a car accident. And my pupils were completely dilated, and I had a couple of experiences like that, like echoes of it, a couple of times after that. And so anyways, that was a very, very powerful experience. I've certainly never forgotten that. And well, I don't know what to think about that. I mean, God only knows what the world is really like, that's for sure. And I've had a variety of very strange experiences that have convinced me that we know very little about anything. So for those who are very creative but high in neuroticism, how should one work to gain emotional stability in order to go out into chaos to do more creative things? That's a really good question. I learned about that by reading Jung's works on alchemy, weirdly enough. And so back again in graduate school, when I was starting to write Maps of Meaning and really tearing myself apart psychologically, trying to understand evil, I suppose, the evil of the Cold War and the evil of the individuals who composed Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. I was reading Carl Jung because he wrote his tracts on alchemy were a lot about self-transformation, and he talked about, it's hard to explain his works on alchemy, but suffice it to say that his advice was something like the advice he derived from the alchemist was that if you were going to mess around with very complicated and dangerous matters, that's a good way of putting it, that you should really put your life together. And so I would say the right way to deal with your neuroticism is to increase your conscientiousness, because we also know that the higher your conscientiousness, the lower your neuroticism. Conscientiousness does seem to keep neuroticism in check. And so I would say, and have said this to many people, clean your room. Organize your life. Like, get a routine. Get up every day at the same time. Go to bed at the same time. Establish disciplined habits. And that will help a lot. Schedule. And here's how to use a schedule. Use a calendar. Use Google Calendar, but don't use it as a tyrant. You want to use a calendar as if it's your confidant and advisor. And what you want to do is use the calendar, sit down, open the calendar and think, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to design a week of days that I would really like to have. So what that would mean then is that you would schedule things that you would consider meaningful and productive, on a daily basis, so that you feel that your life is justified by having a day like that, and also to schedule enough of your responsibilities so that you make progress day by day instead of falling farther behind. And what that'll do is, it doesn't directly affect your neurophysiology, but you're reacting as a neurotic person, a person high in neuroticism, say, you react to uncertainty and the unexpected with more physiological preparedness and more expenditure of energy than the typical person. And so what you want to do is organize your surroundings, because it's a lot easier to organize your surroundings, at least to begin with, than it is to do radical reconstruction on your fundamental temperament, which you might not be able to do at all. So I would say discipline. And the other thing I would say for creative people, and this is true for people in general, but it's really important for creative people, is that if you want to be creative, which is very, very dangerous and very, very unlikely to succeed, although absolutely necessary if you happen to be high in openness, is that you should organize the rest of your life, except for your creative endeavors, in a pretty traditional and conservative manner, if you can do that. Because what that does is buttress you against the unexpected and give you some stability on many, along many of the potential dimensions of your life. And that frees you up to take larger risks in the creative domain. Now, it's hard for creative people to do that because they're sort of blasting out, laterally in all directions simultaneously. But you exhaust yourself that way, and you also risk scattering yourself. Louis Watterson here had a question. How would you suggest someone who's a jack of all trades and master of none conduct themselves? Well, you're probably high in openness, high in creativity. And one of the dangers of being high in creativity, especially if you're also high in neuroticism, is that it's hard for creative people to catalyze an identity, because they're basically Pan-like, like Peter Pan, or like Pan, which means everything. The god of the forest is the god of everything to some degree. And the problem with being everything is that you're also nothing at the same time, because you never specialize. And so I would say that if you're, I think that being a jack of all trades is pretty damn useful, but I would also say that it's really necessary to buckle down and find one primary mode of discipline. And Jack or Louis, if you can't figure out what you should do, then guess. Just pick something that you think that you could hit hard and concentrate on. You don't have to be perfect at it. You don't even have to get it right. But pick something rather than nothing, or pick something rather than all things. And then set yourself to master that. Because, you know, you need to have a discipline, a primary discipline. It's absolutely necessary to succeed in life. Now, once you have a primary discipline, then you can branch out and become a multiplicity in your disciplined approach, and then you're absolutely bloody unstoppable. But you really need that initial disciplinary routine. You know, this is something Nietzsche knew very well. He said, for example, I just wrote about this today, that it was the long unfreedom of Europe's subjugation to the dogmatic structures of the Catholic Church that ennobled the European mind and gave it the capacity to widely range that it eventually developed. But it was that initial subjugation, that initial voluntary slavery, that produced the discipline, that produced the spirit that could then go out and do other things. And it's really, really useful to subjugate yourself to something voluntarily. You know, I think that's partly why it's useful to practice a religious faith, because you subject yourself to a disciplinary structure that way. And you might think, well, that's all oppressive and all of that. And of course that's true. But it also makes you disciplined. And once you're disciplined, like you're like a sharpened sword, man, like a well-tempered blade. And then you can go out there and operate in the world. So, and if you haven't found your passion, then I would say, well, don't wait around till you find the damn thing, because you may never find it. Is pick something and focus on it, you know. And if you move strongly and forthrightly towards it for a number of months at least, or even a number of years, and then you find, well, that wasn't the thing for you, it isn't going to be a waste anyways, because most of the time the pursuit of any disciplined knowledge pays off, even if it doesn't pay off in the way that you initially expect. So Alex Bernstein said, what is the female equivalent of the hero archetype? That's a great question, man. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and of course the women in my class, and perhaps some of the women online too, are irritated or put off, or maybe just alienated, and perhaps properly so, by the fact that the archetypal hero is masculine. Now, there's complex reasons for that, and I would recommend for those who are actually interested in such things to read Erich Neumann's The Origins and History of Consciousness, and also The Great Mother, which are two great works of Jungian psychology. Camille Paglia, by the way, is a big fan of both of those books, for those of you who might be interested, because Neumann does the best job that I know of describing why the symbolism of the hero is laid out the way it is, why Mother Nature is mother, feminine, and why the hero is masculine. Now, but here's how I've come to understand it, and I'm going to use Christian symbolic language because it's the quickest, it's the shortest route to this sort of explanation. So I would say that in the male psyche, the dragon slaying hero is at the forefront, and so that would be Christ in the archetypal mode, because this dragon he defeats is the evil that is encompassed within the figure of Satan. So that'd be like the ultimate dragon. And then behind that is the feminine, the compassionate, the caring, and that would be embodied, say, in the Christian figure of Mary. So you have in the male and female soul, let's say you have Christ and Mary, but in the male, Christ is foremost, that's the dragon slayer, we'll say, and Mary is the secondary character, and although both should be very well developed, and that makes for a much better character. And in the female, it's the other way around, is that the maternal / feminine, so let's say Mary is at the forefront and Christ is in the background. The dragon slayer is at the background, but should be well developed. Jung felt that, you know, it was possible for men to develop the more feminine side of themselves, especially in the last half of life, which is also when he felt that women should develop the more masculine side of themselves. And, you know, we could debate that, but it's a perfectly reasonable proposition. Now, we should note that the figure of Mary is actually what would you say, a heroic figure in and of itself, because you can really understand this if you look at Michelangelo's Pieta. So in that great sculpture you see Mary who's holding the crucified Christ, and that's basically her son, right? Her son who's just been offered up to the world and betrayed by his friends and broken on the cross. And in other words, he's been subject to the worst that life can throw at him. And the thing about Mary is that she knew initially when she agreed to give birth to the savior of mankind, that he would be broken. And that's an archetypal story, because women know in their heart of hearts that their children are going to be broken and killed by the world. That's the human condition. And so there's and of course a woman who's a woman who's well developed loves her child more than herself, loves her child more than anyone else, which is something you can't really understand until you've had a child, but is still willing to bring that child into the world, knowing full well what his or her fate will be. And so there's a real heroism in that. And then there's the standard heroism that a woman can undertake, where she develops her masculine side, which is basically what happens, for example, in Sleeping Beauty. When Sleeping Beauty is awakened by the prince's kiss, you can think of that. You can think of her being rescued by an actual man, but you can also think of that as the masculine part of her psyche waking up her unconscious femininity, so that the two of them can unite and rule the kingdom. It's perfectly reasonable interpretation of that story. And so that would be the development of the masculine side in a female, the side that's stalwart and forthright and willing to go forth into the world and conquer uncertainty. And then there's the Beauty and the Beast archetype, which I think is in some sense the primary female sexual archetype. And Beauty and the Beast is another kind of dragon slaying story. It's more like a dragon taming story, I suppose, where the woman, the virginal woman who's out for an adventure, finds a beastly male. And that's the dangerous man that I was talking about earlier, right? The man who has the capacity, say, to kill, the capacity to harm, the capacity for violence at hand, right? At hand. And then proceeds to tame him, which is a real adventure. And, we know that this is the case because, again, we can refer to those, those rom-coms that are so popular now, with the failed beta males always trying to make friends with the girl and failing. The girls are interested in the rough guys who have the capacity to also be sophisticated and to be, let's not say tamed, but civilized into channeling their harsh roughness, their capacity for evil even, into productive competition, and because competition can be very productive, and then the sharing forth of the fruits of that competition with family. And so those are all heroic aspects of feminine being, and they're not to be taken lightly. They're major life tasks and major life contributions. And I guess another part of the heroic element of the female is the subjugation of her own primacy with regards to her child, because my daughter just had a child, by the way, so I'm a grandfather, so hooray for that. And it went really nicely, and I'm so happy about that, because A, I love my daughter, and B, I really, really like kids. I think they're so great. And so now I'm going to have a kid around again, so that's great. But I mean, one of the things you notice very rapidly if you're a parent is that you bring someone into the world who's now more important under all circumstances than you are. And there's a heroic subjugation of selfishness that goes along with that, that's deeply characteristic of the properly developed feminine spirit. So what is it that you are doing to avoid becoming arrogant? Your current situation is very inviting for that. Yeah, well, I would say a good dose of existential terror will cure you that. There's a saying in the Old Testament that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And first of all, and there's some real truth in that, I don't want to make a mistake. And so I live in constant terror that I'm going to utter some damning phrase that's going to sink everything I've done. And so I'll tell you, if you feel that way about the situation, then the probability that you're going to be arrogant is pretty damn low. And I don't feel I have any reason to be arrogant, Here's something you could do if you're really interested in this, but it's really hard. There's a paper by Carl Jung called The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious. And it's an unbelievably brilliant paper. It's very difficult to understand, but it has to do with what Jung called ego inflation. And so imagine that as you move up a hierarchy of authority or competence, we're not going to call them dominance or power hierarchies because I don't think that's reasonable. But as you move up, you have the temptation of having your ego inflate to match your hypothetical position of status. But what that is in some sense the taking on of the archetype as if it's a personal triumph or a personal construct or a personal invention. And Jung warned very, very strongly against that. And he knew what he was talking about because, of course, Jung had his followers and was an extraordinarily powerful man from a spiritual and a physical perspective. He was certainly no pushover and a very brave person. And he had the temptation of becoming, well, a cult leader, for example, which people have accused him of being, and which he certainly wasn't. And he knew that, you know, if you have the privilege of rising in a hierarchy, what that means, if the rising is real, is that the archetype is operating through you, and that you can't take credit for that. You have to separate your personality in some sense from the archetype. I can give you a funny example of that. It's like, and I hope that nobody takes this wrong, but it's very comical. You know how all the superheroes have a alter ego? So you can't be Superman unless you're also Clark Kent, and you can't be, well, Batman isn't such a good example because he gets to be a playboy billionaire like Iron Man, but Superman's a better example. You know, he's this mild-mannered and meek reporter, and without that he can't be Superman. It's like, well, that's the reason that's such a well-established comic trope, is because comics are deeply mythological, and there's the idea there that the person has these two elements, and one is the archetypal, and it's associated with the infinite. It's like the God in man, you could say that. There's a great icon, by the way, of Christ as Pantocrator, one of the very earliest icons that show him with two different facial halves. The eyes are different, and the face is asymmetrical, and one face is the face of God, half face is the half face of God, and the other is the half face of man, and he's holding a book. I'm having Jonathan Pageau, who's a brilliant carver, I'm having him carve me that image so that I can put it in my front porch, because I love it, and Christ is holding a book. And so, you know, it's such a beautiful image, this idea of man as a duality between the finite and the infinite, and simultaneously holding forth this, you know, wealth of knowledge that's been gathered by the human race. It's mind expanding visual imagery. Anyways, I mean, back to the arrogance issue, is that, you know, I'm so what would you say, attuned to the fact that I'm barely staying on that line between chaos and order, and that any foolishness on my part, or any attempt to manipulate the situation for my own, let's say, selfish personal gain, you know, that sort of impulsive and shallow and immature and short-sighted personal gain, that willingness or wish to lord it over other people, or to feel in some sense superior, man, if I go there with the exposure that I've got right now, I'd be sunk so fast that it wouldn't even be funny, and that would not be pretty, and I would not want that. So I'm doing my best, man, to keep myself on the ground and where I want to be. And I've got my family to help me with that, and I've got my friends who are offering me, you know, corrective criticism on an ongoing basis, and I listen to the negative comments on YouTube, and I try to pay attention to them and evaluate them, and not just dismiss them out of hand. You know, if they're crude or crass or any of those things, then I'm less likely to pay attention to them. But, you know, even when I'm called far right, I pay attention to that, you know, because, well, you got to listen to your enemy. That's the thing. That's another New Testament injunction. You should listen to your enemy, because your enemy will tell you things about yourself that no one else will tell you. Now, some of those things might not be true, but some of them might be. And if your enemy tells you something terrible about yourself that's true, then he's immediately become your best friend, because you bloody well want to know if there's something terrible about you, so that you can get it rectified before it ruins your life and ruins your family's life, and, you know, detrimentally affects the course of the world and all of that. So in one of your lectures, you said the film Frozen was garbage. I don't think I said garbage. I think I said reprehensible propaganda, which I believe it was. Can you elaborate on your thoughts on the film? I can't, because I haven't seen it recently enough to... the only thing I can say is that I left the film with the strong sense that it was produced for ideological reasons, and it was produced as a sort of anti-Sleeping Beauty, and I felt that was entirely inappropriate, because it wasn't a genuine artistic attempt. It was an ideological statement. I actually really liked Moana. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. I thought it was that, I like that, you know, that little girl in the movie allied herself with this very, very powerful but rather uncivilized masculine force, and I thought they got the archetypal balance in that film really quite nicely. So I thought it was quite beautifully done. So I liked Moana quite a bit. What were you like when I was 25? Well, I was obsessed. 25, so that would have been 87. I'd been in graduate school for 2 years. Well, you know, when I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. I was from northern Alberta, this rough little town up in northern Alberta called Fairview, and there were long winters there, and my friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on the oil rigs, and it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. I started when I was 14, and and so I had a lot of bad habits, let's say, and things that were, and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed by, as I am now, and so that would have been in 85. But I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together, and so I started doing that. I first of all I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking, and I started working out, started playing sports, which I'd never done. I was a small kid. I'd been skipped a grade, and I was a small for my age, so sports were never, especially team sports, were never really a domain of expertise for me. Although I skied and went trapping with my dad, and went cross-country skiing and camping and all that. So, but when I went to graduate school, I started swimming. the first physical exercise routine I did, I enrolled in a swimsercise course, I think it was called. So it was me and this like really overweight kid, and like these 60-year-old women and men, they could out exercise me like mad. It was really embarrassing. Me and the overweight kid, we'd be just panting ourselves 3/4 to death at the end of the bloody workout, and these 60-year-old women who weren't in great shape were like chatting away as if nothing was going on at all in the pool. So that was quite embarrassing, and as was going to the weight room, because when I started I could barely bench press 75 pounds, and people used to keep coming over and helping me, which was the last thing I bloody well wanted, but certainly needed. And I got to the point where I could bench press 225 pounds. I think that was the best I did, and I gained about 30 pounds of muscle in a year and a half. So that was a good thing. So like I was kind of a wild man, and I'm a little bit manic in my temperament, and so I was kind of going every direction at the same time. So, and I don't regret that. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed really to get disciplined, and I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that, and got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD, so doing all my research. Like I published 15 papers by the time I graduated with my PhD, which was I think by a fairly large measure the most papers that any graduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. I think that's right. It might have been twice as many, or maybe twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many. And at the same time I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do, because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that, and I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, my sort of what would you say, my hedonistic my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up, and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out. And I got married. Well, the woman who's my wife, Tammy, who I've known since she was 8 years old, she lived across the street from me in this little town called Fairview, and I was in love with her like the first time I saw her, which is quite the bloody thing. So that's worked out pretty well for me. But she came to live with me about the same time, and we decided jointly to get our act together, and we swore that we'd tell each other the truth, which I think she's actually done better than me. Like I don't think she's lied to me ever in our entire marriage, which is unbelievable, and it's been so useful because I can really tell her things and we can really talk. So I tell you, if you want to have a good relationship, man, you embed it in the truth, because if you don't embed it in the truth, you don't have a relationship. It's just lies. It's a tissue of lies, and it will dissolve in the chaos as soon as a crisis comes along. So the truth is a terrible thing, but not compared to falsehood. So all right, so let's look at the live chat here. Please get a better quality microphone. Well, I'm really hoping that the microphone that I'm using right now is working well. It should be. It's a really good microphone. It's what do you call a Rode, and I thought I was using it for quite a while there, but I'd reorganized my office and I actually had unplugged the Rode, and so my voice was unwittingly, unbeknownst to me, coming through this little Logitech high def micro or video camera that I have on top of my speakers, and it might even be doing that for now, right now, as you know, for all I know. I hope not. No, it says the microphone is Rode NT USB, so maybe. God, I hope so. Anyways, you know, I've been mastering a lot of technical equipment in the last year, and so I've got most of it under control, but I don't know if I have all of it under control. So some fan, and I wish I remembered his name because he deserves it, sent me this microphone, so hooray for him, and hopefully I'm going to get access to it. So let's see here. I'm 20. My parents have made it clear they don't want me to leave home. They are both drug addicted, depressed, and antisocial. How do I leave without killing the only positive relationship they have? Well, I think you have to ask yourself a different question. I think you might have to ask yourself the question of how do you maintain that positive relationship into the future if you don't leave and have your own life? You know, because you have to be thinking over 5-year periods here, or even decades. And first of all, you deserve to have your own life. Like, your parents should be fostering your independence. It's their moral duty to foster your independence. Now, hopefully they can do that in a way that makes you strong and that makes you better able to have a relationship with them. But they have no right to use their dependence, let's say, as an impediment to you becoming independent. Drug addicted, antidepressed, and antisocial, despite all of that, they should be saying, you get the hell away from us as fast as you can. You get out there and have a life, and if you can put yourself together and we get to see you from time to time, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? So, you know, you don't get in your children's way. You don't get in your children's way. So I would say, and you know, I can't give you advice because I don't know you, and the devil's always in the details, but I can say generally that you won't be able to maintain a positive relationship with your parents if you do so at the cost of your own destiny, let's say. That isn't going to work out. So, and no one has the right to deprive you of that destiny. Family or not, man, you're to operate out there in the world like an independent soul and to make your way through the world and to offer what you have to offer. And those who love you should be behind you and encouraging you to do that in every possible way. And if they aren't, then you have to seriously think about whether or not, A, whether or not they have your best interest in mind, and B, whether or not it might be better for you and for them if you went and did what you needed to do anyways. So I would say that. So do you have in mind a more specific breakdown of the social sciences? I presume you mean in relationship to the postmodern neo-Marxists that have taken over so much of the university. I would say philosophy seems to be in pretty good shape, strangely enough. It isn't exactly clear why. That's mostly my impression. I would say that in the rest of the university, if the discipline has at least one foot in science, then it's relatively safe. And so I would say psychology is relatively safe discipline because it's quite nicely constrained by the necessity of taking biology into account. That's less true with social psychology, but it's certainly true with clinical psychology, and it's even more true with neuroscience and the animal behavioral side of things. And statistics isn't science, but at least it's rigorous methodologically. If the discipline is very heavily theory dependent, like say sociology, or let's say women's studies, which I have virtually no respect for. Not that that's really relevant, because whether or not I respect it isn't the issue. The issue is whether or not it actually is a high quality discipline, and I don't believe it's a high quality discipline at all. I would also say though, and I'm going to make a video about this in the next couple of weeks, and advice to university students when I launch that website I've been talking about that'll help people identify their courses as postmodern / neo-Marxist, so that they can either take them if they want to be indoctrinated or avoid them if they want to actually have an education. I would say it's your responsibility, it's your responsibility to get educated at university, and sort of despite the university, we could say that. There are great books. You can find out what they are, and you can read them. And you know what the university does, and society, is offer you an identity for 4 years. You're a student, you're a university student, and so that's a credible identity, and it offers you a lot of freedom. And so you might say you might have to get educated despite your courses. And you know, you think, well, that's a bad deal because the courses should be educating you. It's like, well, you got to look at it from a more realistic perspective. You can't expect the university to be a perfect institution any more than you're a perfect person. And at least it offers you an identity to shield yourself with while you're undergoing the difficult process of educating yourself. And so I would say, you know, take responsibility for education. Find professors that you respect and who challenge you, and don't fall prey to the cynical attitude that, you know, you take the course for the grade, or that you should write what the professor wants to hear. I mean, you have to be a real corrupt professor before you'll mark a student for producing an opinion contrary to yours that's high quality. I mean, even the more corrupt professors, even in the more corrupt disciplines, I think are fairly rarely guilty of that sort of thing. So anyways, if it's grounded in science, it's more likely to be reliable. That's the first thing to know. But the second thing is to know it's your responsibility to get educated, and the libraries are full of great books. You can figure out what the great books are. You know, in half an hour you could make a list of 50 great books. I have one on my website. You could read all those. You know, that'd take about 2 years probably to really do a proper job of it. You read the great classics, scientific and literary, historical, all of that. You'll get educated, and then you'll be sharp and coherent and articulate and powerful and able to formulate arguments and able to negotiate and able to formulate problems and solve them. And you know, that's exactly what you should be doing when you get educated. It has tremendous, tremendous economic value, and that includes education in the humanities. So, all right. Did I fail any classes in university? I had to retake stats. I wasn't good at stats. I got it eventually. I needed to know, well, I'm no mathematical genius. We can start with that. But I also needed to know, I couldn't take the assumptions on faith, which was really quite problematic. And so, I couldn't just memorize, you know, I had to understand. And that didn't work out so well for stats. And I also didn't understand at that time that I had to keep up with it sort of rigorously. But I got to be a pretty decent statistician. At least I understand the statistics now. So yeah, I didn't do very well in statistics. But most of my grades otherwise were, my grades in high school, except for grade 10, when I bet my dad that I could get straight 80s, and I think got exactly that. My grades in junior high and high school were pretty dismal because I absolutely detested school, partly for my own reasons, you know, because of my own problems and immaturity, but also because I found it painfully unchallenging, let's say. But in university, college and university, I got very good grades, and which was a good thing because I would have never got into clinical graduate school without that. So, yeah. 225 pounds isn't bad. Yeah, well, I only weighed 160, so, you know, it was pretty good. But it was funny because it was only one day I was able to manage that. I could do 200 with a fair bit of regularity in a bench press, but one day, man, I did 205 and that worked, and I did 210 and that worked, and I got all the way to 225, and I was never able to duplicate it again. So that was pretty interesting. So Jared Chan says, you claim hierarchies are efficient enough, yet you claim 99% of creative people get stuck at the bottom. Oh, yeah, well, that's not a contradiction. What kind of propels you up hierarchies of authority is intelligence and conscientiousness, right? And so then you might say, well, what about creativity? And it looks like creativity is, as you sort of know, is an out-of-the-box phenomena. And the problem is that if you're within a hierarchy, there's a ladder upward that you can climb rung by rung. And basically to do that, you have to do your damn job. Now you might say, yeah, well, isn't creativity, you know, necessary? And the answer to that is absolutely, but it's not that useful when you're at the bottom, because who the hell wants to hear your damn creative ideas when you're just starting out? You know, you're just a pain in the neck. Even if you're right, even if you're brilliant, you're just a pain in the neck if you're creative at the bottom, because you're coming up with all these radical ideas that are going to shake up the structure of the hierarchy. And plus, you haven't indicated your credibility. You haven't demonstrated your credibility to any great degree. So people are going to just write you off they're just going to write you off because it's easier than taking you seriously. Now, the funny thing is that as you climb up the hierarchy, creativity becomes increasingly necessary, until when you're at the very top, it's absolutely vital. And many companies suffer from the fact that they, would you say, promote conscientious people continually up the ladder, and then they end up at the top with no creative people. But it's hard for the creative people to climb to the top, because creativity isn't one of those things that ratchets you up a hierarchy of competence. So they're efficient on the conscientious end and efficient on the intelligent end, but creativity is a whole different thing. I mean, partly because how the hell do you evaluate a creative person? You can't, by definition, because to have a structure of evaluation means that something has to be done in a tried and true and measurable manner, and that isn't what a creative person does. Like they make a left turn, you know, a 90-degree turn, and they say, well, I'm going to do it completely differently. It's like, well, how is someone going to evaluate you if you do that? Now, you might be right, and you know, creative people are often wrong, but sometimes and vitally dead right when no one else is. But it's really problematic. I mean, if you're a creative person, your best bet, I would say, is to discipline yourself and ground yourself in something relatively practical that will enable you to eke out some sort of living, and then to practice your creative endeavor on the side. You can head headlong into it and try to make money and be creative at the same time. But I'll tell you, man, my experience has taught me, and this is a lot of experience and a lot of watching, and it's not something I'm happy to say, is that it's very difficult for creative people to monetize their creativity, and most of the time it's an exercise in futility. So what you have to do is stabilize yourself in some sort of productive and traditional domain, and then, you know, use your extra time to work creatively and see if you can branch out that way. You know, you can always try to start a small business too, or even a big business, but again, that's a high risk, high return proposition, and there's a technology that goes along with that too. You can't do that like a fool. You know, you have to know what you're doing in order to do that. So what evil deity will enslave the human race come the eclipse? I think that's probably the god Kek. That would be my guess, as far as I've been able to tell so forth. Could you please tell the difference between equity and equality, and why is equity dangerous? Well, it's not actually equity and equality, it's equity and equality of opportunity. Well, you know, it's a truism, I think, that's agreed upon by liberals and conservatives alike, that the interests of individuals and society are best served by opening the door to the participation of all who are qualified, regardless of their attributes in domains that have nothing to do with the qualifications for the position. So imagine that as a worker, and that would include managers, executives, etc. As a worker, you have a function like a tool. You're a tool, and I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't be too down on that. It's good to be good for something, and it's in society's best interest that those who are able to be the most efficient tools are the ones that are placed in the position. And so you want to open up the competitive landscape to all players, not least so that society can most effectively exploit the people who are most productive. Now, it also has the side benefit of allowing individuals to utilize their talents and to take their place in the social world. But people are very diverse in their abilities, like incredibly diverse in their abilities, and that's mostly evident, for example, in the domain of intelligence, you know, because, well, the range that includes the majority of people runs from an IQ of about 85, or let's say 70, to an IQ of 130, although there's plenty of people who are outside those domains. It's like at 70, you're pretty intellectually impaired, right? You're not going to graduate from high school with an IQ of 70, except under very extreme circumstances. With an IQ of 83, which is about 10% of the population, 85 is 15%, you're going to have a hard time reading well enough to follow instructions. You know, and with an IQ of 115, you're going to do pretty well at a sort of mid-level community college. And so an IQ of 145 is going to prepare you for like high success in complex domains, say like law or managerial positions where the environment is transforming very radically. There is immense differences between people in their cognitive ability, and in their conscientiousness, and in their negative emotionality, and in their energy levels, and in their creativity, and all sorts of traits. And because of that individual diversity, there's no reason to assume that there is going to be equality of outcome. And that's what equity is. I've got to change the battery in my camera. And we're back. Apologies for that. With this DSLR, whichever it is, there's some, I won't go into it. I have to change the battery after about an hour or so. Anyways, back to intelligence. What was I saying? Talking about individual differences and the differences in intelligence. Oh yeah, equality of outcome. Well, the only way, given the wide range of human capacity, first, you don't want to organize your society such that every single category of outcome has exactly proportional representation from every single possible category of person, because that isn't, you have to use so much social force in order to make that occur that the consequences, the negative consequences, will far outweigh the benefits. It's better to open up the marketplace to allow a very large range of hierarchies to emerge, and then to let people compete for their position, to compete and cooperate for their own positions. And the other problem with equity is, like, who the hell is going to who's going to decide which groups are going to be categorized? Here's an example for you. Let's imagine you stratified the population by IQ, which we do, by the way, although we don't do it as evidently and obviously as we do, say, by sex, or perhaps even by race. Would you actually recommend that an equal number of people be drawn from every category of IQ to be surgeons? I mean, that's palpably absurd. So there's too much social engineering required to produce equity of outcome. Now, having said that as well, the historical data on equity are absolutely clear. The societies that have tried to aim at equity are the terrible communistic societies of the 20th century, and they were so goddamn so unbelievably murderous and counterproductive that it beggars the imagination. And so I can't even believe we have a conversation about equity, because it's such a pathological idea. It's completely invalidated by the historical data. So, all right, what does my average daily schedule consist of? Well, that's fairly straightforward. I get up around somewhere between 6 and 8, and then I work till 10, as hard as I can, flat out, every single day. So, and I've been doing that with very little variation, although it's been much more extreme in the last year, since 1985. Like, I work I would say 14 hours a day, at least 14 hours a day. And so that's about 100 hours a week. And the time that I don't do that, I spend with friends, but mostly with my family. And so, yeah, and I work as efficiently as I possibly can. I'm always trying to do everything I can as fast as I possibly can. And I'm accustomed to that because, like I said, I've been doing it for 30 years. So that's my daily schedule. And I don't know even what I would do if I didn't do that. I have this cottage that I go to, although I generally spend time writing up there. And I go swimming with my wife, and we go canoeing, and I can take a break in that way. But most of the time, if I take a break even up at the cottage, generally what I do is like carpentry and fix the place up. And I don't like to be unoccupied. I have to be occupied doing something productive all the time, because otherwise I'm not pleased with myself. And so, and you know, I decided a long time ago that I was going to try to live a hyper efficient and hyper productive life. And so it's been a challenge. It's an enjoyable thing for me to some degree, because I'm very interested in trying to figure out how much I can possibly do in the shortest period of time all the time. And that keeps you alert and awake, and it's a great challenge, and it lends my life a substantial amount of meaning, and it's been very successful. So, you know, so that's kind of what it's like. Okay, let's see what else these chat people say. Oh wow, apparently, broken mind. In Tolstoy's Confession, he talks about meaning in faith. He had many problems with religion and the church. How can a non-religious person find a meaningful non-religious faith? Oh, well, you know, it depends on what you mean by non-religious. You know, I would say, for broken mind, you know, I was thinking about this today. I was writing about this today. I was writing about Dostoevsky as compared to Nietzsche. You know, and Nietzsche was a great critic of Christianity, and so was Dostoevsky. But Dostoevsky, I think, trumped Nietzsche with regards to his attitude towards Christianity. And I think you could really see this. You could read the Brothers Karamazov. I would really recommend that. Broken Mind, everything. Get your hands on Dostoevsky. Read everything you can he wrote. Because Dostoevsky really, and you like Tolstoy's Confession, you know, read Dostoevsky. But, you know, Dostoevsky has this character in the Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha. And Alyosha is a monastic novitiate, and who's a kind of a naive guy intellectually, although a very good person. A simple person intellectually, let's say, perhaps not naive. And he has this older brother, Ivan, who's a devastating intellect and a handsome man and a rake with the women and like really like a well put together human being, although quite nihilistic and cutting in his intellect. And Ivan can absolutely demolish Alyosha in a debate and does quite regularly. But Alyosha basically wins the argument in the book, let's say, as the book plays itself out, by acting like a good person. And I would say, you know, if you want to develop a religious faith, in some sense, forget about trying to develop faith in God. I don't think you can will yourself into that. I'm not even sure that you should. But I do think that you can decide that you are going to do what you can to live a meaningful life and be a good person, and start to meditate on what that means, and then to start to put it in practice. And then you find your religious faith in the domain of action rather than conceptualization. And that's really the primary domain in which it should be manifested anyways. Like the primary Christian commitment, for example, is the imitation of Christ, not the belief in his divinity, you know, or the belief that he died for the sins of mankind or any of that. And I'm not making light of that. But the primary moral injunction is to try to live the archetypal life within the confines of your own subjective being, to try to live the most divine life that you can. And if you try that, and if you take that seriously, and if you meditate upon that and ask yourself what it might mean, then I think you'll find the religious element of your life fleshing itself out quite nicely. So that's the answer to that question. Thoughts on the drug epidemic? Well, I'm not sure there is an epidemic any more than there always has been. I know that there is now a tilt towards drugs in the US in particular, like meth and fentanyl and the other opiates, and that's quite a catastrophe. A lot of that is occurring among people who don't have meaning in their lives, I would say. And you might think that's a facile answer, but it's not. You know, like here's the rat literature. Like, it's, if you take a rat, lab rat, typical lab rat is, you know, genetically bred to be identical with many other lab rats, and he lives alone in a cage, and he's got a pretty miserable rat life, because rats are social animals and they don't like to live in cages by themselves. And you can get a lab rat in a cage addicted to cocaine in no time flat, and he'll like press a lever for cocaine reward, to pretty much to the exclusion of all else, including sex and often including food. But if you take that same rat and you put him in a rat family, you know, in a rat social hierarchy, in a rat environment, and give him something that rat like to do so that he can be satisfied, it's very difficult to get him addicted to cocaine. And so I would say the reason that people take psychomotor stimulants, and all the drugs of serious abuse are psychomotor stimulants, regardless of what else they might be, they activate the dopaminergic system, which is the system that tracks reward and that is associated, that's activated when you pursue valuable goal-directed behavior. If you don't have that, if you don't have a valid goal, if you don't have no real valid meaning in your life, if you don't have a valid ambition, then you don't have any way of activating that system. And why the hell wouldn't you take drugs? It's like you have to have something better to do to not addict yourself, you know. So I would say that a huge part of the current epidemic in the US in particular is manifest among broken men who have no real place in society, and providing them with money isn't going to help that. They need a productive and meaningful existence, and which is the paramount goal, should be the paramount goal of social policy. For example, it isn't the alleviation of poverty that's really the issue, because people in the West aren't poor. There might be a bit of a distribution problem, but we're not poor. What we have is we have a problem of meaningful engagement, and that's what has to be addressed, and that's why I do the work that I'm doing. So Are you aware of the similarities in the work of Anthony Robbins and with a lot of what you are doing in the self-authoring suite? I'm not specifically aware of the similarities, although I know that Anthony Robbins is a well-known motivational speaker, and generally motivational speakers try to motivate people to pursue something productive in their life. So, you know, I would say likely that there are people who are concerned with motivation that are working at different levels of the communication strata, and I'm working at a fairly abstract level, and hopefully Mr. Robbins is working at a level that is productive and helpful to lots of people. He certainly had a very stable and long career. So, although I'm not aware of any specific similarities past that. So, what do you think about ADHD? I have it. I am frustrated by my failures in life. Because of it, I am trying to become a chemist, and I am failing at school. I think ADHD is a catch-all diagnosis. I think that people who are extroverted and unconscientious, for example, often manifest the traits of attention deficit disorder. I know that there isn't any real evidence of long-term utility in psychopharmacological treatment for ADHD. I would say, though, if you are having a hard time concentrating on your goals, that what you should probably do is set yourself up with a therapist. Find someone you can talk to, you know, so see 2 or 3 therapists. I know it's expensive, but so is not having a life. Find someone you can talk to, and then make it, and someone practical, probably a behavioral therapist would be best, and then have them set goals with you and help you strategize to stay on track week to week. That's the best thing, or to set that up with a friend if you can't do it with a therapist. So that's the best advice I have for that. And keep at it, man, you know, but you got to learn to schedule. You got to learn to break your days down into disciplined subsections, and you got to practice at it and practice at it. And there isn't an easier answer that I know of, but having someone that will help keep you responsible, I think, can be useful. I've seen that be useful for people who have attention deficit disorder, let's say. You once compared religion and science as tools that can be used more accurately to understand your position. Do you think gender and biological sex are 2 tools in describing an identity? Not really. I think most of the work on gender is rubbish, to put it bluntly. I get what is meant by it, you know, that there is a socio-cultural layer specifying gendered behavior on top of biological sexual identity, but I think it's been so polluted by political idiocy that it's a concept that's almost entirely invalidated. It's used for perverse purposes. It's not used as a tool of understanding in most situations. So I think that the concept of gender could be useful if it was used to specify the purely socio-cultural layer of like sex type behavior, and I think it could conceivably be used in that way, but I see very little evidence that it ever is. So, my brother is a soldier in Iraq. As a clinical psychologist, what should one do when coming from such a chaotic place back to a tame and structured one? Well, I guess that would depend to some degree on exactly the nature of his experiences in Iraq. So it's hard for me to elaborate on that further. I mean, I would say, though, that one thing he could really do, and this is somewhat self-serving, or could appear to be somewhat self-serving, I suppose, is I would strongly recommend that your brother do the self-authoring suite when he comes back, because it'll help him, and probably concentrate on the future authoring program to begin with, because it might take a while when he gets back before he can meditate on his experiences without that meditation being harmful. So, for example, there's pretty good evidence if you've had a traumatic experience that you shouldn't re-subject yourself to the traumatic experience repeatedly before, say, about 18 months or something like that is passed. And it isn't exactly obvious why that's the case, but there's a pretty good literature indicating that it is. So I would say that when he makes the transition from Iraq back to normative society, that the first thing he should do is generate a plan, a plan about how he would, and this would be the same even if you were coming out of something like prison or making a change, a radical change in your occupation, is you need a plan, right? You need a plan so that you can because you can't just make that adjustment without knowing what you're doing. So that's what I would recommend. And if he does come back traumatized, then I would say, traumatized soldiers often have to develop a very comprehensive philosophy of good and evil, And so that would either mean perhaps talking to a decent clinical psychologist about what his experiences were, or perhaps reading some of the literature. And I've outlined those books on my website at jordanbpeterson.com that can be really helpful in understanding, in helping someone understand the evils of atrocity and warfare, and even the necessary evils, let's say, of atrocity and warfare. So okay, let's see here. Do you think a lot of your work is the form of the bargaining stage of grief? No, I don't think that. There's these stages of grief that have been identified. I can't remember who did the work. It seems to have been quite helpful work for many people. But I don't think I'm bargaining. Exactly. I don't think I'm suggesting that people bargain. I think I'm suggesting that people work and sacrifice. And you could think about that as bargaining, but bargaining has the connotation more of pleading, let's say. And I don't think that work and sacrifice constitute pleading. I think that they're actually really effective means of dealing with the world. And I think that people can be highly effective and competent, much more than they think. And so it's an interesting question, and I can see why you posed it, but no, I don't believe it. So, could you comment on the Buddhist concept of impermanence and the finite nature of reality being what gives it meaning? Oh yeah, that's a good one. And how that concept conflicts with ideas of eternal life in heaven. Jesus, man, that's a lot of questions. That's a lot of hard questions. Well, let's start with, I'm going to only answer one of those, I think. It's just too much effort to get all three of them in the same. It's like hitting 3 fastballs with the same swing of the bat. I don't think I can manage it. How does the finite nature of reality give it meaning? How is it that the finite nature of reality is what gives it meaning? God, that's such a good question. Well, I can answer this obliquely. I'm going to talk about something that happened to the comic book character Superman in the late 70s. So Superman was extraordinarily popular from the 1930s right up to the 1970s. But one of the things that happened is that as he became more and more popular, he also got more and more powerful, right? So by the 80s, Christ, you could bounce a hydrogen bomb off Superman's chest and he could juggle planets. And, that's all well and good, except what kind of adventure is he going to have, right? Like, if you can't blow him up with a hydrogen bomb and he can juggle planets, nothing interesting can happen to him. He can be anywhere he wants at any time, and he can do anything he wants with no effort under any circumstances whatsoever. So he's like a permanent deus ex machina. I think I've got that right, which is Superman is boring because God always comes in at this last moment and saves him from whatever predicament he's in. Well, contemplating that, perversely enough, can give you some appreciation for the finitude of life. It's like we're like infinity captured in the finite, like a genie encapsulated in the lamp, and genie is the root word of genius, by the way, so that's not an accidental comparison. And it's this strange combination of infinite capacity that characterizes human beings to some degree, with this terrible finite limitation that does in fact make our lives the adventures that they are. And so this is quite nicely documented in the Tao Te Ching, by the way, and I would really recommend the translation by Seth Rosenthal. I really think it's elegant, and the Taoists are very good at formulating the utility of non-existence. In fact, I think there's actually a verse in the Tao Te Ching called the utility of non-existence, where they talk about the empty space in a pot, giving it its utility, and so that's what the pot isn't, in some sense, that makes it what it is. And that's also the case with human beings, is that we have these intense limitations that we can then attempt to transcend, and that it's meaningful to transcend those limitations in such an interesting way. And I don't know what that means in the final metaphysical analysis, but you see that we do this voluntarily to ourselves too, because bored people will place restrictions on themselves just for entertainment. That's exactly what we do when we play a game. So for example, if you're playing chess, you subject yourself to all sorts of arbitrary limitations, right? There's only a certain number of things you can do with the chessboard and the chessman. And then you you open up a whole universe of possibilities by adopting those limitations. And there's something about that that speaks deeply to the absolute nature of reality and maybe justifies the tragic finitude of being. It's something like that. And that's how it looks to me. And I've thought about that quite deeply. So, can an introvert thrive in the field of law, or should they avoid it altogether? Yes, actually, we gathered a lot of data on lawyers and extroversion. It doesn't predict law, what would you say, proficiency at law at all. It's not associated with it at all. What predicts proficiency in law is intelligence and conscientiousness. And then after that, relatively low agreeableness, because it's a very competitive enterprise, high emotional stability, so low neuroticism. But introverted lawyers do fine. Now, if you're an introverted lawyer, there's going to be some challenges, and those challenges would be developing the social skills necessary, say, to stand up in the courtroom if you happen to be a lawyer who's going to do courtroom work. But there's plenty of like solitary work that a lawyer can engage in. But then the other problem might be for an introverted lawyer that, you know, you want to develop your web of connections, your social network, and of course you want to do that in any enterprise, right? So it's a challenge for introverts in general. But I would say there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to assume that law is a discipline that an introvert should avoid. So, you know, go for it. But you need to be conscientious, right? Because it really matters if you're conscientious as a lawyer, and you should have a pretty decent verbal intelligence, because otherwise it's going to be a hard road. Because lawyers have to deal with an awful lot of verbal material, and they have to formulate complex arguments. They have to be able to write and communicate. And so, you know, you want to think about those elements of your temperament more, I would say. Okay. Dr. Peterson, do you believe the evidence for God lies primarily in interpersonal experiences? Well, it lies to a great degree in interpersonal experiences, although I don't even know if you could call that necessarily evidence for God. It depends on what you're willing to accept as evidence. Like even that experience that I had, that I described earlier in the Q&A, isn't evidence for the existence of God. You know, it was certainly a religious experience, and I found it extremely compelling. But from a scientific perspective, it's almost worthless as evidence because it's purely subjective. Now, I think there are elements of experience that cannot be got at objectively. And so I'm willing to take subjective experience under some circumstances as evidence, insofar as if I have a subjective experience that I find credible, I'm willing to act on what I believe to be its meaning. And so I'll test out my interpretation of that experience pragmatically. And that's good enough for me. I'm willing to consider that evidence, but you can't really consider that scientific evidence. So, but then what other evidence is there? Well, there's also, let's call it the evidence that's instantiated in the great religious texts of mankind, the great philosophical texts and the great literary texts as well. And I wouldn't exactly call that subjective experience, because you can garner it through your exposure to culture, but you know, whether or not that constitutes evidence depends on what you're willing to define as and accept as evidence. So I'm told that my overanalyzing is a double-edged sword, but I'm suffering from being this way. Yeah, well, you're probably, you know, high in openness, and maybe you're very verbally intelligent, so you're pretty much stuck with that. Maybe you've got a bit of mania to you too, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I find relief when I drink alcohol, smoke, or take certain drugs because it slows down my thought process. How can I use my overanalysis to my advantage? Well, I would say find yourself a difficult cognitive problem to solve. You know, pick a challenge. But, you know, you also might consider talking to someone. You find relief when you drink alcohol. That might be an indication that some of what you're overanalyzing isn't so much a consequence of excess cognitive power, but an excess of high negative emotion. And so that would be illustrated in, say, high trait neuroticism. We're going to release the Big 5 aspect scale here later this month, and you'll be able to take that, and it'll give you a pretty good detailed description of your personality. And there's 2 dimensions of neuroticism: withdrawal and volatility. And, you know, if you're overanalyzing because you're what do you call that? Ruminating, that can be a consequence of high levels of anxiety. And the reason I'm suggesting that is because you said you find relief when you drink alcohol, and alcohol is a very powerful anxiolytic agent, anti-anxiety agent. And so lots of people who have high levels of anxiety do ruminate, and so overanalyze, let's say, and they find relief when they drink because alcohol is a primary anxiolytic, like Valium, like benzodiazepines and barbiturates. So the fact that alcohol gives you relief probably indicates that some of what's driving your overanalysis is anxiety. And then you could, exercise can really help with that. I would also recommend, this is something really to think about, I don't know what your eating habits are like or your sleeping habits, but if you are an anxious person and that's manifesting itself in, say, neurotic overanalysis, there's 2 things you can do very rapidly, 3 things really, that will help quell that. Well, 4 things even. Number 1, get up at the same time every day, and I would recommend in the morning because that's when people generally get up, and it's good to do what everyone else does unless you have a good reason not to. Number 2, eat a large breakfast, right? Keep it carbohydrate light. You know, don't eat toast and and Fruit Loops. That's not going to do the trick. Make it fat and protein heavy, and eat more than you want. You might say, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, this has nothing to do with what you want or what your appetite is. It's like, you need to eat in the morning. If you're an anxious person and you don't eat in the morning and then you stress yourself out, your body hyperproduces insulin. It takes all the blood sugar out of your blood, and that dysregulates your metabolism for the entire day. You can't reset it till you go to sleep at night. And I've had lots of anxious clients who would say fall into the overanalytic category, who were like virtually cured by eating a large breakfast every morning. I would highly recommend that. You could try some physical exercise. Weightlifting is really good for curing anxiety. Another thing you could do, as I alluded to earlier today, is to make a schedule and start attending to your daily micro routines. So, you know, you got to figure out what your overanalysis is. It might be cognitive, like maybe you have a very active mind, you know, you're fast verbally. Are you fast verbally? One way you can find that out is to do something like write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S, for example, in 3 minutes. Do that with a bunch of your friends, and if you're someone who writes down way more words than anyone else, then you're verbally fluent, and that might be driving some of your overanalysis. But my guess is that you're suffering from some rumination that's related to anxiety, and so I told you what I think the simplest ways are to rectify that. So I hope that works out for you. Let's see, what else have we got here? Okay. Almada Warrior says, can you answer this question, Dr. Peterson? And the answer is, I can, but I'm not going to. Okay, let's see. Loki Doodle says, I cleaned my room finally. That's good. I hope that it has a pronounced positive effect on the rest of your life. You know, it's funny because since last September, I would say, I redid my house. I'm going to put a video online about that because I had a camera crew in here this week videoing the whole house because it's quite interesting, I would say. But since I've stepped into this chaotic domain last September, my room has been a mess. The rest of the house hasn't been too bad, but I've never got to cleaning my room. I finally did this weekend. And what was interesting, because when I did it, I mean, I've been doing a lot of other things, but that doesn't help keep at bay the negative psychological consequences of being in material chaos. When I cleaned my room this weekend, it made it easier for me to finish this chapter that I've been obsessing about. So that was quite interesting. So, you know, cleaning and organizing your room is no joke. It's a great meditative exercise, especially if you take it seriously. And you're not trying to make it look neat, although that's not a bad aim. You're trying to turn the room into somewhere that the person you want to be could live. So what do I believe that there's any connection between leftist identity politics of past decades and the emergent white identity politics of the alt-right? Yes, I think there's a direct causal connection. It only stands to reason that if identity politics is going to be the acceptable mode of communication, that there are people who are on the white side of the equation, let's say, who are going to decide that they're going to play exactly the same game, clearly, obviously, and horribly, because I'm no fan of identity politics, but what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So, but I would recommend that people don't do it because, the radical leftists and their damn identity politics that's unbelievably pathological. And if you decide to fight that by playing the same game, you think, well, I'll play the same game and then I'll win. It's like, you won't, because by playing the game, you lose. That's the thing about your political opponents, is you don't play their damn game. You play a different game. And so, what I've been trying to encourage people to do is, instead of playing the collectivist game, and that would include alt-right identity politics, say, is to play the individualist game and to get their act together. The best revenge, I would say, but you shouldn't be doing it for revenge, but the best revenge against the collectivist leftists is to live a stalwart, meaningful, and high-quality individual life. And that's also the pathway that requires the most responsibility and sacrifice, and so I think is the most honorable and least self-deceptive. So what is your view on the book/movie Fight Club? I thought Fight Club was deeply fascist in a very interesting way. I'm saying that in some way dismissively, although I actually liked the movie. I also think it was fascist because it was a celebration in some sense of force. It was fascist sort of in the same way that the Iron Man character is fascist, but I also thought it was a really interesting exploration of the idea of developing the shadow. And I do believe that if men don't become consciously dangerous, they become unconsciously dangerous. And so it's much better to become consciously dangerous. And it's something that every man should really aim at. So you should be someone that no one will mess with. But then you should keep that under control, right? First of all, you should be harmless and naive. Then you're a child. Then you should develop your capacity to be dangerous. Then you should bring that capacity to be dangerous under control. Then that makes you a man, as far as I'm concerned. So, Jared Chan says, I just wanted to thank you very much. Love you heaps, man. LOL. I'm slowly reading all of Jung's books thanks to you. Well, you have to read them slowly, man. There's no way you can read those fast. Like, watch out for yourself, because those things play vicious games with your mind. So, praying for you. Well, good. I could use some prayer, man. So thanks, Jared. Much appreciated. So good luck with the reading. And, make sure you're doing something practical and easy at the same time, because Jung, he's hard on person. That's for sure. If you really want to twist your head in a knot, you could do some reading. You could read some Nietzsche at the same time. It's a nice adjunct. Though Jung wrote some books on Nietzsche, like his commentaries on Thus Spake Zarathustra. So, yeah, good to hear from you. Thanks very much, man. So let's see. Whoa. Still haven't quite mastered this live chat thing. It zooms around quite a bit. Hey, when was that high school student program you were coming out with happening? Oh, that's the future authoring, the self-authoring program for high school students. Man, we're trying to get that out within a month, but I can't say for sure because it's a software development program. But we're aiming at the fall, that's for sure. So, and we're hoping it'll be a killer like the university self-authoring program was. For those of you who don't know, you probably all know because you're Patreon subscribers, but the future authoring program seems to improve the performance of college students by about 25%. We're hoping with the high school students to have the same impact at a much earlier age, and to teach kids to define themselves voluntarily and to start charting their destiny. That would be a lovely thing. And we're going to sell directly to the high school students instead of trying to go into schools and so forth, which I think would be just an exercise in frustration and utility. I should say that, and I don't know how this got set up, I probably pushed some button that I didn't even notice, is that some of you seem to be donating money, and the money is associated with questions. And I've clicked on some of those, and I'm not sure what to make of that exactly, because I don't know how it happened exactly, and I want to make sure that I get questions from everyone as much as I can. So if I miss you, I hope that you're not donating unless I actually click on your question. So, but if that isn't the case, then I apologize. I'm trying to keep up with as many questions as I possibly can. Thoughts on the Jews? Well, the first thing I could say about Jews is that a lot of my friends happen to be Jewish, and I think that's partly because Jewish people, and that's in part a cultural thing, are very, very interested in ideas, and I happen to be very interested in ideas, and so I have a great affinity for Jewish people, and so, and I think that Jewish people are overrepresented in positions of competence and authority, and that's often because they're extraordinarily competent. So, hooray for them. That's how it looks to me. So, what do you have to say about girls who grow up without fathers? Be very careful in who you choose as a mate, because you don't have that much experience with what constitutes a good man. And so I would say be cautious, man. Be cautious. Look for someone who treats you well. And not because of weakness, don't confuse being afraid to offend you with treating you well. Someone who treats you well is someone who's tough and forthright and self-reliant, but who is able to listen and to negotiate in particular and to tell you the truth. And so, and don't give yourself away too easily. And that's what I would say to girls, period, is don't give yourself away too easily. It's a big mistake. You'll regret it. You'll regret it. So. I'm starting to slow down here. Nietzsche was pretty fun to read. Got all his works. Nino the Sinner. Well, that should really help you with your sinning there, Nino. So, yeah, Nietzsche, he's a trip, that's for sure. If you guys are thinking about reading Nietzsche, don't start with Thus Spake Zarathustra. You should read that last. I would start with Beyond Good and Evil. And fun is a pretty weird way to describe it, though. Read Dostoevsky, too. That'd be good for you. What advice would you give to a person high in agreeableness and conscientiousness? Get a significant other who is left-leaning or one who is leaning towards radical leftism? I would say get a significant other. Don't get a significant other based on their political predispositions, Get a significant other that you can trust and that you are attracted to and that you want to build a life with, and leave the political stuff for when it's necessary, because the political stuff should only be engaged in when it's necessary. Do you think Islam is compatible with the West? Not in any self-evident manner. So, although I would also say that Islam is part of the West, we should actually give that some consideration. Do you mean, is Islam compatible with Christianity? I hope so, but it isn't obvious to me in what manner it's compatible with Christianity. We'll see. That doesn't mean that Muslims aren't compatible with Western society. Many Muslims are no more radical Muslims than Christians are radical Christians. In fact, many Muslims aren't any more Muslims than many Christians are Christians. And so, I would say, generally speaking, across populations, people are pretty decent, and as individuals, generally speaking. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the belief systems that they inhabit are commensurate. So, Alt Cap Right says, I think you should fortify your ideas on Christianity. I am doing my best to do exactly that. So, Dr. Peterson, what was your relationship like with your mother and father? It was and is pretty good. They're both still alive, thank God. I just went up and saw my dad for his 80th birthday. He's in good shape. I actually gave him a Kekistani flag as a joke, which he really appreciated. So I think he's got that flying up in his cabin way the hell up in northern Saskatchewan, which I think is pretty comical. I love my parents deeply. They've been a great source of support for me. My father... I had some struggles with my father when I was an adolescent, partly because I was depressed, and so was he. He was a great father when I was a young child. He spent so much time with me and paid so much attention to me and taught me to read, and I have nothing but great memories of him before grade 6. And then we had about 3 years that were rocky. Well, more than that, probably about 5 years that were rocky, which we both contributed to, and so did other circumstances. But since I moved away from home, which I did at 16, we've got along just fine, and I think we have an absolutely superb relationship, and they've been incredibly useful and supportive in the last year. So, and my mother is a wonderful person. She's a little too agreeable for her own good, but she's tough, and she had she raised 3 kids, and she went out and had a career, and she's put up with my dad, who's a pretty tough, stubborn guy, and she's a lovely person. I love her deeply, and she's been very good to my kids, and I've had a good relationship with them, and I would say it's just got better and better as we've got older and straightened ourselves out. And I would say that about my whole family, including my sister and my brother and their family, and it's functioning pretty damn well, and so thank God for that, man. So I have a friend who's considering majoring in psychology. What advice would I give them? Stick to the biological end of it as much as possible, with the exception of the great clinical works, because they're very much worth reading. Master your damn statistics, because that'll open up career doors for you. Nail your grades. Go get a degree in clinical psychology. A PhD in clinical psychology is so valuable that it's almost incomprehensible. So that's what I would say. And learn to analyze the research reports and pay attention, and it can be an absolutely great career. All right, guys, it's been a long day. I spent most of today writing my chapter 7 of my new book called 12 Rules for Life, which is an absolutely deadly chapter. It's just about killed me. I have gone over today, I went over every word and every sentence and rewrote them, and it's a chapter on sacrifice and work and the battle between good and evil in Christianity, and the nature of a meaningful life. And it's been hard, and I'm tired. And although this has been great fun, and I would like to say in closing, once again, thank you very much for the support and for all of the, I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the positive response my work has got over the last year. It's been I've been amazingly well compensated, both financially and psychologically, for my efforts, which I'm thrilled about, and I hope that I can keep delivering to you what it is that you seem to be, what would you say? I hope that I can continue to deliver whatever it is that I've been delivering in the past, that all of you have been finding of value. I am doing my best to do that. I think it's the right way forward out of this bloody, chaotic political mess that we're in. I've been thinking about that for years, that the way out of the ideological morass is the strengthening and fortification of the individual. And I hope you all participate in that, because it's a cliche, but I'm getting tired, so it's the best I can do. There's no limits to what a person who decides to put themselves together can do. And so I would very much encourage all of you to aim at that, because what the hell else have you got to do in this vale of tears, this tragic vale of tears, but put yourself together and prevail. And so on that note, man, over and out, and I'll talk to you all in a month.